All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. I did want to make a quick note about last week's Bible study. Unfortunately, since my computer glitched, we don't have a recording of last week. Unfortunately, between me having issues on my side, Zoom never recorded and downloaded it. So my apologies to everyone who missed last week. So for those who are, let's do a quick recap of kind of some of the discussion we had last week, since we don't have a recording of it. And I know even if we don't have folks listening, or we have Helen back with us, and hopefully some other of our group members will be watching this on the recording, as long as this week doesn't mess up. So what was some of the discussion from last week that we had?
Oh boy. Get the story.
So we certainly had a change in main character, right? Last week.
Well, this is all about Joseph and irritating his brothers.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they sell him into slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Here, I don't see 37.
Yeah. So I guess I'll go just through a quick recap, because this week is a little bit of an odd one out. And then we'll get back to the main story that we're kind of going to finish out the rest of Genesis with. So we've entered into kind of the last big chunk where it's kind of a cohesive narrative. Where before we started with the creation story and some of the more mythological sounding stories of great people living long ages and kind of the foundation of our world. We then kind of switched into the Abrahamic family, where we followed Abraham around for a while. We've had Isaac and Jacob, and we kind of wrapped up Jacob's story. And now we're switching tones and looking at Joseph, the current youngest of Jacob's sons. And the story kind of started out with him having dreams, his brothers being really annoyed with him, and that passage wraps up with his father thinking he's dead, him being sold to slavery and ending up in Egypt, and kind of the question of what's going to happen next. So that's where the story is going to continue next week. But before we get there, we take a pause and we actually look at a one-off story of one of his brothers. So this week we're looking at the story of Judah and Tamar, which is one of those stories we don't get much in Sunday school. I can't say that I've ever heard a sermon preached about this passage. I'm curious if you all had even knew this story existed before today.
I never did. I didn't hear this story before. We hear the story of Joseph, but this one about Judah is a new one to me.
I looked in our other book to see if they would explain it, and it's left out. It's just the story of Joseph 36, skip 37. And then they say Joseph is all about, maybe it's wisdom literature and it was, whatever. But so I just wrote at the top of the page, it's weird. It's
weird, isn't it though? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, for a very long time, you've talked about the absence of women and women being named in the Bible. And here is this whole chapter on Tamar and everything that happens to her, where it treats her as if she's a major character, but I've never heard of her before. So, it's why her? Why this story? And I, obviously, I don't know if anybody knows, but.
So I will say, as odd as this story is, as just like out of the blue, like it does not fit into the overall narrative of the story. It's like, we're going to pause the main story and have this side episode over here on this like character. There's actually a lot going on. There is a reason why it's included. And believe it or not, her name came up in our scripture reading at the Advent 1 this past year. So here is where things start to connect, and I will lead off with this. If you want to join me, we're going to flip through a few passages in the Bible to kind of get a little bit of context, because this story needs a little bit of like bumpers for bowling. We're going to hit some things in other places to kind of make sense of this. So if we want to stick our finger here, flip to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1. So Matthew begins with that whole long list of names. And in Advent 1, we read every name. And there's always that pattern of like, when it's like this person, son of this person, son of this person. We have a few of these in Genesis. We can pick apart some of it, but we also tend to tune out. The thing is, Mary Ellen, to your point, who are the named women in the Bible? And what you will see in verse 3, in Jesus's lineage, we have Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, by Tamar. Tamar's not just named, she's included in Jesus's lineage.
Oh.
Really interesting.
That's why it's in here.
It's an interesting choice. Was it the first grandchild? Did he have the first grandchild?
So Tamar,
Judah?
we will get to why Tamar is included. She's important enough, not just to be in Genesis, but to be remembered all the while later. Yeah, Mary Ellen.
Verse 3, and Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, are those the twins? It's making sense. Okay.
We'll put the pieces together. I just want to show you where this is going. There are other, if you would allow me to pause just a little bit to talk about some of the other women that are included in this list, because I believe there's 4. Notably, the traditional matriarchs are not included. Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, not included. Tamar is included. There's a second Tamar that is, where is she? I believe she was, at least. Looks like I am mistaken. That Tamar is not in here. All right. But we do have Ruth. So in verse 5, Solomon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. Oh, there we go. There. It's Rahab, not Tamar. I'm getting my names mixed up. So Boaz's mother is Rahab. Rahab is a prostitute. She is a prostitute that is important when the people of Israel are going into the promised land. And you know the story of when the people march around the city and then they blow the horn and the walls fall down? Before they march around the walls and the walls fall down in Jericho, they have 2 spies go into the city and check it out, and they almost get caught, except for a prostitute opens the door and says, hey guys, hide in here. And she hides the 2 spies, and she says, hey, I'm going to go call those guards back in here unless you promise me when you attack this city, you protect me and my family. And she protects her family, and she, once again, gets incorporated into this major, this very important lineage that leads us to Jesus. So we have yet another person who is acting the prostitute in this lineage, who is remembered and important. We have Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. Ruth, we all know the story of Ruth. She's the Moabite woman who follows her mother-in-law, Naomi, back to the promised land. She is notably an outsider who is worked in. Once again, all of these 3 are the women who lead us to King David. So, and I believe there is one more woman, but her name is escaping me. So just to let you know of the type of women that are important enough to be remembered in the lineage. It wasn't the matriarchs. It's these crafty women. So with that in mind, let's flip all the way back to Genesis, and we're going to talk about the story itself. So, because the story is weird, and because a lot of people haven't read it before, I'm curious of some initial opinions on the story. After reading through it, what are some of the thoughts that are just bubbling to the surface before we go into the details? Yeah, go for it.
A lot of trickery. There's a lot of it going on.
Yes.
On both sides. So, yeah, it's like, whose turn is it now?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And what is the purpose of its inclusion is, I was trying to figure that out. It does seem that Tamar wants to have children by Judah for a reason. I'm not sure what it is. She wants to be part of the bigger story. Judah is the son of Jacob.
Right.
But not
We'll
the
talk
oldest.
about. I have that question down. We're going to talk about that at the very end. Why this story? Because it's here for a reason. There is a very big why here.
Okay.
So, any
Not
other
Not
thoughts
the
or
right
questions?
response.
The thing that shocked me when I read it, and it was a reasonably enjoyable read compared to others, but this Lord that just killed people, just
Yeah.
like snapping a finger, bing, gone. I was uncomfortable with that.
Yeah.
That's fair. We're going to wrestle with that a little bit. Yeah, there's just this person's bad, so they're dead.
I was surprised he had this friend called Hira, who was not even an Israelite. He was of something else, Abdullamite or something. And so he was kind of going outside of his own people to find a brother.
Any other thoughts, questions? All right, so let's start to dig in. We kind of have some of bearing, excuse me. So the first few verses are like location and time setting. We know some of this may just be the person compiling, because this very much is, I believe, a story. There was probably a standalone story that they're like, we need to include this. Where do we put it? And so they're like, well, it probably happened after Joseph was sold, so we're going to plop it in here. And so there's a few transitional verses to try to smooth it out a little bit, even though once again, we see some features of other stories. One feature is kind of, Gary, like you were saying, it's enjoyable. It's one of those that's more action filled and a little bit, it's not quite as emotional as the Joseph story, but there is a lot of movement in the story. And at the same time, we still get some older features in it that we'll get to in a moment, where there's a lot of puns, names mean other things. So this story actually has a little bit of that earlier mythological kind of feel to it in how characters are named specifically. But we have this place setting that this is after the time that Judah went down from his brothers, and that we have the place where he settles. And so we get the sense that Judah's now old enough that he's setting up shop for himself. He is the family business is going, his younger brothers have it, he's now setting up shop for himself. And part of this is, he takes a wife. Here's one thing that I do want to call a difference to, we're not going to linger here too long. He takes a wife of the Canaanites, but unlike some of the other people who have taken Canaanite wives, this doesn't seem to be an issue here. It's just kind of mentioned. We don't have his wife's name, we have her mother's name, which is also weird, but it's what's in front of us. So we have his Canaanite woman named Shua. He married her daughter, it's the daughter of Shua, and he married her, and we have these 3 sons. So this is one where translation, there's always the question of, do you translate literally? Do you translate, like the connotation of the words? Do you translate the sound of the words? Here they opted to just transliterate. Onan, and Shelah is literally the Anglicanization of the Hebrew words. And because they're names, the translators most often chose to translate them as names, kind of almost conventionally, like we don't tend to shift people's names from language to language. However, all of these words are puns, or not puns, pun is a wrong word. They're all wordplay. So is literally basically a play on the word evil. So the first son is named Evil, would be almost, which is how you would read it in Hebrew. The first son is named Evil, the second son is named Suffering, and the third son is named Transaction.
How interesting.
What mother would do that?
And that's why I bring it up. How likely is it that these three sons actually have these names?
I don't know any mother who would do that.
This is something we see in a few other stories where the stories likely describe a real event, but have distance from it. This is where it kind of is almost like some of the older stories where it's a little bit more mythological. We see this in Ruth as well. The sons of Naomi have names that are like pestilence, suffering, and death, and they all die. They're not their actual name. It's a play on words that they're doing to create the setting of the story. I doubt that these three sons have these names, but it's kind of like foreshadowing. So Evil dies because he's evil, and Suffering dies because of, well, we'll get to some of this. And then the last son has this transactional sounding name. All of these are not strictly the words, but they're all plays on the words, if that makes sense.
Was there any?
Yeah, go
there
for it.
anything that Judah named Evil versus his wife? It says that he called his name Error.
Yeah.
Or is that just going to complicate things?
I'm trying to think of an English equivalent, and the only one I can think of is like my name, actually. So my full name is Christina, which is a name, right? But Christina is a very close tie to the word Christian. It literally means of Christ if you go back far enough. And we kind of know that like Christ and Christian is in the name Christina. Not unlike like Barbara, the root of the name Barbara is barbarian.
Ooh.
Yeah. And so these names are one of those where it's not a direct one-to-one, but it's close enough that it's meant to imply it, if you kind of see where it is. So I will not say this 100% that Judah did not name his son Evil, but it sounds like a storyteller's like flair, like the storyteller decided to, they may not have known the sons' names, and so they just made it have a little bit of zest or flair in the story. So it's part of the storytelling of it, not necessarily the history of it, if that. Does that kind of make sense?
How do
Yeah,
you know?
his
translate-
son grew up really fast.
Hold on, Mary Ellen and Sue, you're talking at the same time.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear Mary Ellen.
All right, how about Mary Ellen, you say your comment and then Sue will hear from you.
It was like, when you're translating all of this, how do the people decide what this is? You know, whether it's an embellishment or whether it's, you know, actually literally translated. I mean, I could see where there's different interpretations on things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sue, what was your comment?
Well, building on, I just can't remember really, but the I I said something about the father-son relationship, and it seemed like the son was awfully young to be getting a wife. But there's a passage of time. But I think that's really interesting, because if you're reading this, you wonder, what are you supposed to know? How are you supposed to know what's important? What's the message? Because it's confusing. And, we don't know, and they probably didn't. Yeah, and you're saying, yeah.
There
With
is.
your,
Oh, go for it, Helen.
well, I was just going to say, with your explanation, I'm thinking maybe they just, when they talked to them, they used a different name. But these were told by a storyteller maybe a long time after it happened. And maybe they put it in there, as you say, for the value of the story rather than the actual name. But that's just a thought. But
Yeah.
as you,
So when it comes to the issue of translation with things like this, there is no one good way to do it. And that's one of the reasons why we have so many different versions of the English Bible. If you want to dive deep into the issue of translation, I can actually send an email out afterwards with a link to it. There is an NPR broadcast show called Radio Lab that has a wonderful discussion on basically the complexities of translating poetry. Because poetry is notoriously difficult to transition between two languages, because you have the factor of like the rhythm and rhyming, which do you replicate the rhymes and like the kind of the beat or the kind of how the flow and it feels when saying it and when hearing it? Do you translate the words literally as possible, find the best one-to-one translation of the words itself, rhythm and rhyming be damned? Or do you try to find a mixture of the two, where you try to find words that are close enough to the words that still sound somewhat rhythmic? Because the question is, what part of it are you translating? So where this is fascinating, especially with the Bible itself, what's agreed upon as one of the most beautiful translations of the Bible is the King James Version. The King James is lyrical, it's poetic, it was translated for beauty, and is one of the most, like by technicality, it is the most inaccurate version of the Bible. There are things where they whole cloth made up new verses. The idiom of having a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, that comes from the King James Proverbs, but the Hebrew doesn't say that. Not at all. The Hebrew does not talk about birds, hands, or bushes. They literally thought of a phrase that they thought meant the same thing, but was not at all tied to the word. And so this is one of the things of like the questions of like, how do you do it? The Message is another beautiful example of they tried to translate not the words in the page, but what they thought it would mean today. They modernized the language. They did not try to replicate the syntax. They literally changed some of the things, but they were trying to translate the message of it, not the words of it. The version that I use, which is the New Revised Standard Version, I like this academically because it is very close to the actual translation. It is not meant to be pretty. It is not translated necessarily for poetry. They do the best they can, but this is what's considered a more wooden translation where they try to keep it close to the original. But even here we see this weird goof where it tends to be names are translated as names and they don't shift the meaning of when names have significance. What mine does is it gives you the transliteration of the name, and then in the notes it says this name means this, and that's a choice. So this is an issue, right? So when reading, what are the sorts of things that you value in a good translation? Do you want it to be as close to the Hebrew as possible? Do you want it easily readable and using concepts that we understand today? Or do we want it beautiful and sounding poetic when it sounds poetic? What are the things we value?
I like
Well-
accuracy.
In the Bible, accuracy, but when I've had a couple of novels that had really bad translations, and I don't know if they were literal or not, but they made me bonkers. I mean, one was Crime and Punishment. I thought I couldn't finish it, and the other was The Magic Mountain. The Magic Mountain read as though it had been translated into Chinese and then translated into Russian and then translated into Finnish, and that kind of thing, where you could not. It's just unbelievable. So I think that in fiction and other things where literal meaning isn't important, I'd rather have beauty.
Chris, did you say the Bible you use is the New Revised Standard?
Yeah.
Called? Okay.
Yeah. So I use this version purely because this is the version that we were required to use in seminary. So it's one of those that I am the most familiar with, but we used it in seminary because it is very academic. The NIV, the New International Version, is often what I find in Presbyterian churches the most common because it tries to be accurate, but it kind of smooths it out a little bit. So it's not quite so wooden. It's a little bit massaged, so it's a little bit more natural to read, which is why we tend to use it in churches, because it's a little bit less chonky.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But the message is like the key example of something that's very smoothed out, which is meant to be readable. It's meant to be digestible. It's not technically accurate. And the thing that you'll see in versions of the Bible, like the message doesn't actually give hard verse numbers because they've smoothed it so much. Some things are a little bit jumbled. They give glosses of verses. So you will see like this is verse 1 and 2, and they make it readable. They translated it, but it's not a one-to-one parallel to verse 1 and verse 2. So, but this issue that we're talking about with translation and what do you value, this is why some religions do not translate their original text. In the Jewish community, you learn to read Hebrew. You learn how the Hebrew writers are thinking. The same goes for Islam. They only consider the Quran to be the Quran when read in Arabic. There are English translations, but it's seen as an interpretation. They don't see that translations are the thing itself. They value the original language because there's some things you can never translate. In the Christian church, we don't have that same value of the original language. The thing that used to be valued is Latin, but there is no book of the Bible that was originally written in Latin. So even that's kind of strange that we historically have valued a very specific translation of the Bible. But I think that has ultimately led us to be very comfortable with translation. So that's a very long answer to your question, Mary Ellen, but I hope it kind of gave some texture to what's going on here. All right, so let's jump back into the story. Since we haven't gotten very far and we are at the halfway point. So, true to his name, Judah's firstborn was wicked, and he died. We're not giving an explanation of how he died and why, other than that he's wicked. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, and we've talked about the Lord's presence in these stories, and he was missing in the Joseph story that we've read, and here it is that the Lord put him to death. So the Lord is active in this story.
Yeah, good observation. Yeah, that all of a sudden, that's another like hallmark of some of the other stories we've read, right? Where it seems like the Lord is kind of in the mix and pulling strings. So this string is pulled, this evil dude, we don't have context, but it's also, so after the second son, we'll wrestle with the question Gary brought up of like, why is God just putting these people to death? Like that seems a little weird, but it is you doing something in the story. So we're still hanging on to that. So the second son, Onan, there is this, we have this situation where Onan is asked to marry Tamar, and the obligation for him to have sex with Tamar to produce an heir. This is where, once again, we're going to put a finger in this part of the Bible, because there is actually a very specific explanation of what's going on here. We're going to flip over to Deuteronomy. If you don't want to, I'll do it for you, because I'm just going to read straight out here, because we are, I don't want to run out of time for this story. If you remember last time that we read in Deuteronomy, we were in Deuteronomy 22. We read that list of don't have sex with this person list, don't have sex with this person, don't have sex with this person, don't have sex. And it's like teasing out, don't have sex with these family members. They don't belong to you. In a few chapters later, in chapter 25, we have the explanation of what's called a levirate marriage. This comes into play once again in the book of Ruth. So these are like the two stories where you reference this specific passage. So I'm just going to read this, and then I want your all's response of what you all think of this. So starting in verse 5. When brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside of the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her into marriage and performing the duties of a husband's brother to her. And the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. But if a man has no desire to marry his brother's widow, then his brother's widow shall go up to the elders of the gate and say, my husband's brothers refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in all of Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the town shall summon him and speak to him, and if he persists, saying, I have no desire to marry him, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elder, pull his sandal off his foot, and spit in his face, and declare, this is what is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. Throughout all of Israel, his family shall be known as the house of him whose sandal was pulled off. So, this is the practice of a levirate marriage, which is the thing that is being requested, which is at play in Tamar's story. Even though it's, once again, it's a law that's said in Deuteronomy, it seems to be a cultural practice already. If you have a wife and you die, your brother is responsible to have a kid with her, specifically a son. And that son is not your brother's son, it is yours. The first one is, at least. And that is so his house continues. If the person, if the husband who dies does not have a brother, the other thing that we see in other writings is that the next of kin is responsible. So if it's not, when Onan and die, we see that Shelah is the next in line. And then if Shelah is not in line, it falls to Judah. If it's not Judah, it actually is one of Judah's relatives. So it just keeps going out. So the woman is always protected. It's basically a way that if your husband dies, his family is still responsible for you. So what do you think of this practice?
I mean, taking care of the the widow is financially seems like a good idea, but producing children with the widow, it seems odd. She had to be married,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. Is that still true? Do they still do that?
I don't think the Jewish community does this, no. Not, at least not that I'm aware of. So knowing this practice is kind of the worldview we're working under. Why would Onan not want Tamar to conceive? Any
It
idea?
seems if that's the culture, that why would he care? Why doesn't he just go along with it? I don't understand that.
Who's the older brother?
Well, the older brother is gone and dead, right? But
But-
Reuben,
I mean, if this is their culture and it's expected of him, why is he so against this?
Financial reasons.
Oh,
Here is the unsaid thing, which is why I read that passage, to know all the details of the levirate marriage. What is implied is, if Tamar, so is the firstborn, right? The
mhm.
firstborn inherits the lion's share. Onan's responsibility is to conceive with Tamar, and the firstborn of Tamar is not Onan's son, it's son,
Mhm.
which means that child is the son of the firstborn and would continue to inherit the lion's share of Judah's
Oh.
property.
Mm. Yeah, I can see where he would care.
That's why that's why he cares.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what's interesting is he does half of the responsibility. He is willing to have sex with Tamar, but what is happening in this, to be blunt, where this is kind of flowery, is he's pulling out. He's having sex, but he's pulling out and not finishing, which prevents the act of impregnation. The odd thing, and this is just a history of interpretation. I don't know a church that's, well, no, I won't say that. If you have heard pastors or church people go on and on about the evils of masturbation, this is actually the verse they use. And I don't know why, because that's not what it's talking about. But if you've ever heard of the evil of spilling your seed, this is what they're referencing, which you see is not at all actually what's being talked about. What's being talked about is, don't deny your brother his inheritance, which is effectively what Onan is doing.
Mhm.
So we don't know what did that was wrong and was struck down, but Onan is struck down by God because he is denying his brother a piece of the inheritance that by his birthright is his. So occasionally, this is where let's talk about the fact that these men are struck down for their evil deeds. This seems to be an uncozy idea for us today. Do you think that this, or how do we make sense of it in the context of this story? Is this something that we assume still happens today, or is this one of those things that we kind of think of, this is people making sense of the world? And we don't actually, there's other forces at play that made this happen. This is a story that we tell, this is a literary device, or do we see that maybe God might strike down evil people today? Any thoughts?
Well, I don't think he would, and I don't know why he did then either, but, well, I guess I do. I understand it because of their culture. And of course, I don't take everything literally either. I mean, it's a story. So what is the lesson that we're supposed to get from that? What are we supposed to believe? from that
Mhm.
in our culture.
Right. So if we look at it as, or Helen, what I hear you wrestling with is like, if we take a step back and say, this story tells us something about our life in God.
Mhm.
Like, maybe we don't have to tie it to history very tightly, as we have already seen with the names, that it's already not tied too closely to history because these names are weird.
Mhm.
What is the point if, or what do we glean out of the fact that it does seem like in this story at least that evil deeds have or have bad consequences?
Mhm. True. Good point.
Or what does it say about duty and honor? Mary Ellen, what's your thought?
I don't like the idea that because he did not fulfill his obligation, that because of that, the Lord struck him down. That to me, there should be some kind of an intervention from the family. That there, should be some pressure put on from the human side to fulfill his obligations. And this is missing from the story. It's just, you didn't do this, the Lord strikes you down.
Missing from the story, the firstborn was just wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he's gone. Poof.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if that's still going on nowadays, he's asleep at the job. That's not funny.
Yeah. So I don't think there's any one answer. This is one of those things that we just get to continually wrestle with, and it kind of leads open-ended of, like, once again, this almost acts as a mirror. If we're uncomfortable with this, then why? And what does that say about what we believe in God versus what they seem to believe?
Mm-hmm.
But the fact of the matter is, going back to the story, Judah seems to be, all of a sudden, he's lost 2 sons. And both of these sons seem to have died in connection to Tamar. So he has one more son, and by obligation, he is supposed to give his youngest son to Tamar. And so what he says, instead of giving a young boy, and there does seem to be some credence to, he is a child, I'm not going to marry a child to you. The thing that is actually where the things start to be in the question of, or the questionable territory, is Judah is still legally supposed to be obligated to take care of Tamar. Even if he's not marrying his son immediately, the kind of the moment that you have married someone into the family, she is your responsibility unless you have no relatives left. She returns to her father's house only upon divorce, is kind of what we see. What Judah says instead is, return to your father's house and wear the garb of a widow. I will call you back when my son is ready. Judah already is not fulfilling his obligation because he is not taking care of Tamar, even though she is his responsibility.
Right.
And what we see is, it's likely that Judah had no intention to give his youngest son to her.
Right.
So, with the 15 minutes left, I'm going to quickly give a gloss, and we're going to talk about this interaction. So, quickly, Tamar gets word that her family, so Judah's wife dies. That is a key fact. His wife dies. They are going to the temple, or going to this holy place. Tamar gets word that her father-in-law is coming this way, so she throws off the widow's garb. She throws on the outfit of a prostitute. Notably, where the cultural connotations are different, you can see one of the things is just by context, we see that prostitutes have their face covered, so you don't know who's underneath. So she dons the veil. Judah sees her and is like, hey, come here, honey. He refers to her as a temple prostitute. This is not uncommon in the ancient world, that some of the holy women would be sex workers, that basically it was part of a ritualized thing that it seems like Judah's more than willing to participate in. There's a question of payment, and instead of getting paid on the spot, she's like, give me your signet ring, your cord, and your staff. Those are 3 things that are basically like Judah's driver's license. These are identity markers. These would be known to Judah specifically. And so it's kind of like when you're in a store and you're like, oh, I forgot something in the car. Can I leave my license here so I can go get the thing in my car and come back and pay you? You've done that, right? This is basically what that is like, give me your signet ring and I will trust that you will come back and pay me. Except Tamar has no interest in actually getting paid by her father-in-law, so she just takes off and runs with his identity. She takes his driver's license and runs. He comes back with her payment and is all of a sudden like, where's the prostitute that that she was right here, and everyone around like, there is no temple prostitute. What are you doing? That person doesn't exist. And he panics and he doesn't want to say anything because he's worried about being embarrassed. And so instead, when it's found out that Tamar is pregnant in her widow's outfit in her father's house, that is when people start getting mad. And all of a sudden Judah is very upset because she has disrespected his family. And then when she says, I'm pregnant by this man, and basically shows the community his driver's license, all of a sudden, guess who is embarrassed? So with all these shenanigans, the question is, who is in the right? Yeah, Mary Ellen, did I miss something?
Well, to go back to a previous discussion on who it was okay for a man to sleep with, his daughter-in-law was not on the list, right?
Right.
Well,
I have to check that. I'm actually not 100% positive.
Wasn't it just that he could sleep with his daughter? That was okay, but his daughter and his wives, but nobody else?
He's not supposed to stay with his daughter. You remember with Noah, the daughters went into Noah and.
So daughters are in this weird category where by the list of relatives that is in Deuteronomy, your own daughter is not on the list. So
Right.
because she is your property, you technically can. It's frowned upon, but it's not by the biblical code outlawed.
Oh,
Um,
not incest, huh?
So in a roundabout way, he met his obligation to his daughter-in-law.
right. This is where it's actually in like a weird category, because I need to actually check. You're not supposed to sleep with your son's wife because your son's wife is his property, but his son is dead.
Right.
Which means your kin is now responsible to bear a child with her. And so if his youngest son is unwilling or unable to produce an heir, that responsibility actually does go back up the lineage and is Judah's responsibility. So if his son was alive, yeah, she's on the no-no list, but because he is dead, Tamar is now his responsibility, and he has the responsibility to give his son an heir. So she's now back on the okay list. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
But his son is able.
Yeah.
And, so there's, some technicalities here of, you're talking about his embarrassment. I think it's enhanced by the fact that this is his daughter-in-law as well.
Yeah. Certainly. But Gary, your comment is right. Of like, ultimately, he ended but it's because Tamar took the initiative to basically force him to.
Well, that's
Which
pretty
is-
typical. I'm sorry, I was just thinking that's pretty typical about the women that we've been reading about, taking the initiative, like Abraham's daughters and, some other things where the women have just kind of, they may be subservient, but they still have some power and control.
Right. Yeah, this
Needlessly.
is one where we see Tamar exert a lot of agency here. She takes her destiny by the reins and goes. And the thing is, in the end, Judah exhorts her for doing this. In the very end, he said, this is verse 26. Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more right than I, since I did not give her my son Shelah." So he recognizes that, yeah, she is not actually in the wrong here.
Okay.
But then the next statement is he did not lie with her again. So he then seems to reassume the position of the normal father-in-law.
What ranking did these sons have now in the structure? They would be his youngest sons, but he has Shamar, whatever his name is, that would be the oldest living son to inherit.
So this is once again going back to the Levirate laws. The first son born is to the deceased brother. So the firstborn, there's the complication with the twins, reminiscent of Jacob and Esau, where they're kind of fighting to get out first. This will be complicated at the very end of the story as well, but the firstborn between those two is Er's son. It isn't Judah's son, it's not Onan's son, and it's not Shelah's son. The firstborn is the son of Judah's firstborn son. So he is the continuation of the line of Judah, and this is why it matters. It's because Judah, if left up to Judah's own actions, he would have not had heirs. And certainly his firstborn son, who is supposed to inherit and carry on the family line, would not have a proper heir. So it is only by Tamar's actions that the line of Judah has been continued in the proper way.
Okay.
That is why this story is so important, is because the line of Judah is what becomes basically the heart of Israel and later becomes the entire kingdom of Judah. Okay. That kingdom would not have existed without Tamar's action.
Okay.
Which is why Tamar is double righteous, is not only did she pursue justice on her own side, she deserved an heir, and her father-in-law was cheating her out of her livelihood. She had no son, she had no daughter, she had no kid to take care of her. In her father's house, that is not where a widowed woman should be. So she did this probably out of her own well-being and pursuit in old age. But in the end, she actually saved Judah's rear end because she is the one who ended up carrying on his line. So does that explain why the story is still is in here?
Yeah, I wonder why Judah didn't think of it.
Don't know.
Certainly makes the story a lot more meaningful to hear all these sidelines. Thanks. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. What happened to Reuben?
We will see what happens to Reuben. Reuben isn't gone for good.
Oh, okay. Because he was the oldest, wasn't he?
He is the oldest, yes. So Judah, I believe, is the second oldest. He's the second born. but all of the brothers show up at the end.
Okay.
So we'll hang out with Joseph for a while, but the brothers do show back up. Fear not, they're not gone for good. It's just so notably, going back to some of the themes we've talked about for a while now, this is one of those stories that comes from one source specifically. It is the story of the tribe of Judah, which is the southern kingdom, which is why we see only God language that refers to Adonai, the Lord. We see no reference to God or El. This is because this story is only a story in the southern kingdom, because the northern kingdoms don't care about Judah. So this is a story that is specifically from that one source that kind of gets plopped in here. So that's just a sidebar. We're almost at time. Let's hit this last little chunk very quickly. I think some of these themes we've seen, they should be reminiscent of some of the other stories we've seen. So it comes time for Tamar to have her kids. She finds that she has twins. Once again, we have twins. They're wrestling in the womb. We see that one gets its arm out, and the nurse is good enough that she ties a crimson string on it, and it pulls it back in. The other twin kind of evidently pulls the one twin back, and the other one gets out first, and then the one with the crimson hand comes out second. But because the one with the crimson hand technically got a piece of himself out first, that means he's the firstborn, even though the other one gets out entirely first. So this is almost a more extreme version of Jacob and Esau, where Jacob was clutching his foot. This time they're actually punching each other to get out.
That poor woman.
The thing is, this is one of those things I would tell you, keep this in your back pocket, okay? Because this detail is important, but it's not going to be for 5 or 6 chapters from now. We're going to have a lot of stories, but the fact that these two were wrestling to get out, and there's the question of who is the firstborn, once again, this will come back into play, but it's not going to come back into play for a long time. So I just want to keep this nugget of information at hand. So all in all, what do you think of this one strange episode?
Doesn't feel strange. Okay.
I
It certainly
can
is a, oh, go ahead. Who was talking?
Whose turn
Mary
is it?
Ellen. Mary Ellen, go for it.
It's my turn. Okay. I can see its significance in the long run. As far as, I was thinking that it had to be Christians who included this story so that they would have the lineage of Jesus intact. And, the whole story has more purpose than when I first read it. I kind of blew it off when I read it. And now I can see the potential of what these twins are going to get involved in. And, I get it, I guess I'd say. Okay. My turn's over.
Helen, what were you thinking?
Well, I was thinking much the same thing. So I would just go along with Mary Ellen's explanation.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I am curious about the twins. Their names is there any meaning in their names as there was with the others, or is that really their names?
Yes. So Perez means a breach, like a breaching whale, a breach, and Zerah means brightness. And my notes say that it's possibly alluding to the bright color of the crimson thread.
Mm-hmm.
So most names do have meaning. It's one of those things that I think our naming conventions have very much changed over the years, and it's different from culture to culture. that most names in the biblical text have a kind of like, this means that is a little bit closer at hand than English names tend to be. Like the example of my name being Christina is a little bit closer of a tie than a lot of names. But I know there are name dictionaries that it's like, here is the etymology, and here's the Old English, and here's the original meaning. But we don't hear it as close at hand unless you're named something that something like often like flowers. Like people do, I have like Rose is a family name for me. And so like Rose is very much has that very close tie to what it is. A lot of biblical names are a lot closer in their meaning as to like where they come from. And I think that's why translators often choose to translate the sound of the name instead of the meaning of the name. Because if all the time we were reading about Simon Peter and it would basically be like, the rock said to Jesus, call me out onto the water. Like Peter comes from Petra and it literally means the rock. And so like, do you want to hear about Peter or do you want to hear about the rock? And so we tend to not translate the meaning of name, which is just a convention of most translations.
Thank you.
Is there any significance that the names of the twins are spelled different in Genesis than they are in Matthew? Or is that just written at a different time by somebody different?
That is an eagle eye observation, Gary. I don't know this for a fact, but my guess is the fact that this is how you translate the Hebrew. The Gospels were written in Greek, which means Hebrew names were transliterated into Greek. And that's probably an accurate translation of the Greek.
It's just a translation. Okay.
You see actually a weird thing with Jesus's name too, because Jesus is a Greekified version of the name Joshua, they think. Jesus, like they think his name was actually closer to you could hear it in Yeshua becoming Yeshu, which becomes Jesus when you put it into English. So some names kind of get this weird twinge when you become a multicultural society. So that's probably, I'm going to blame Greek for the difference in the spelling.
Okay. I didn't mean to make an issue out of it. I just
Oh, no, it's interesting. All right, folks. Well, shall I close this out in prayer?
Sure.
Yes.
All right. Let us pray. Good and gracious God, you know, yet again, we read another story about the messiness in humanity. We see the story of Judah and Tamar, and the culture is different than ours. The understanding of what is right and what is wrong is different than ours today. Some of the details in the story are things that hit us a little bit weird, but the core of the story, God, that we read is that you work with imperfect people and in imperfect situations. We see these people who had choices and that sometimes made the right choices and sometimes didn't make the right choices, and still they are worked into your story, the story of your people, the story of Jesus, which means that there is space for us in this story too. Space for us when we make the right decision and space for us when we make the wrong decision. So I ask that you give us that assurance and comfort today, that it doesn't matter if we make the right choice or the best choice, even as we are trying to make the best choice we have and the right choice as we understand it, but no matter what we choose, you will be with us, showering us with grace and love. And let us continue on with trust and faith in that. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Good discussion.
Thank you. We're going to continue with Joseph next week. So back to the main story.
All right.
All right. See
Great.
you all then.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.